Good evening, folks, and welcome on this beautiful Wednesday evening in Naples, Florida, to the First Presbyterian Church of Naples. Especially, we welcome you who are visitors, and maybe this is the first time you've been to this facility. It's an historic church for Naples. We're in our 73rd year. We say we're in the heart of Naples with the love of God. We worship, we love, we grow, we serve, we welcome all. That means each and every one. And together we seek to follow our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. My name is Craig Goodrich. It's my privilege to serve as the senior minister of this congregation. And tonight we have a special presentation. How many of you were here this past Sunday to hear Oh, a lot of people came back, Ron. Ronald C. White, Jr., born in Glendale, California, attended UCLA, Princeton Theological Seminary, obtained a PhD from Princeton University, had a distinguished teaching career at various schools, including Colorado College, Whitworth University, Princeton Seminary, UCLA, served as the dean of the San Francisco Theological Seminary. Ron is an ordained Presbyterian minister, currently serving as scholar in residence at the San Marino Community Church in San Marino, California. Ron lives in Pasadena with his wife, Cynthia. In the last 2 decades, Ron has entered another chapter, and he's become a best-selling author, having written 4 books on Abraham Lincoln, a biography on Ulysses S. Grant, and most recently, this book entitled On Great Fields. It's the life and unlikely heroism of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And some of you were here this morning, and we heard a wonderful presentation about that book and this Civil War hero. Ron preached this past Sunday. His sermon title was Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, a wonderful presentation on this book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech. Another book that Ron has written is simply entitled A Lincoln, and these 3 books are available at a book table after the presentation tonight. You can purchase them, and Ron will stay and sign them. So we're in for a treat tonight. Ron, you combine such intellectual curiosity, creativity, scholarship, love for history, love for our country, love for our church and the faith. All together, it makes an inspiring and passionate package, and we're looking forward to having you with us tonight. We're delighted. It's a timely talk. The topic, Abraham Lincoln, Wisdom for Today. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Ronald C. White, Jr.
Thank you. May I offer my thanks. This has been a most wonderful 5 days together. So many terrific conversations, meeting you, hearing your insights, your stories, your experiences. I feel I'm a beneficiary of these wonderful times together. Thank you, Craig, for your friendship, Andy, and seeing Coke again. This has been very, very special. Let me begin with a story that really struck me in a wonderful way. In January of 2009, I received a telephone call from the State Department. They said that people in Europe had been staying away from United States embassies because of the war in Iraq. And they thought with a new president, Barack Obama, there might be an opportunity to bring people back to those embassies and consulates. And they wanted to start with what they called soft diplomacy. So I said, well, what is soft diplomacy? They said, Abraham Lincoln. Would you be willing to go to Germany and speak in Hamburg, Münster, and Berlin? So my first stop was in Hamburg, this beautiful, much bombed city, but now beautiful city in northern Germany. And the audience was 12th and 13th grade teachers. And so they asked me a variety of questions. I talked about Abraham Lincoln. And then I asked them a question. I said, well, tell me, why are you interested in Lincoln? And a teacher stood up and she said, we know American history. We know the story of George Washington. We know the story of Thomas Jefferson. But she said, in our country, our history is filled with what you might call aristocrats, people of wealth, people of prestige. For us, Abraham Lincoln is the most important American. He represents for us what America is all about, that you can start with nothing and you can rise. Lincoln often talked about what he called the right to rise. So she said, Abraham Lincoln, with all of the great American figures, is for us what America is all about, the right to rise. So I tonight have given you this handout, which I call Abraham Lincoln, Wisdom for Today. Now, Lincoln was a 19th century person. He can't help us with climate change or what we should do in Ukraine, but I do believe that his values, his spirit, has everything to do with who we are today and who we will be in the future. Let's refresh our memories. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809. Jack, thanks for all those great questions at dinner. I sometimes ask an extra credit question to audiences. When was Abraham Lincoln born? And I think, sadly, as we compressed Lincoln and Washington's birthday into the President's Day weekend, we lost a great deal, because people used to say Washington's farewell address on February 22nd. And students in classes used to say the Gettysburg Address on February 12th. But there is a wisdom for today. He was born in 1809, as Jack reminded us, in Kentucky, moved with his family to southern Indiana, and then they crossed the river into Illinois. He separated from his family and moved to this tiny village of New Salem. I say tiny village. When he moved there, it was actually bigger than Chicago. And they thought they had a great future. Well, they were out of business in 10 years, and Chicago went forward. So the first selection in our handout for tonight is Lincoln's first announcement for political office. We've just gone through this election and we've listened to all kinds of candidates announce why they are candidates for political office. I've actually had people tell me that they've written in Lincoln's name on some of their ballots. Listen to what he had to say. What he had to do in those days was to declare his candidacy in the local newspaper. And then you would have other people who would recommend you, sort of attest that you are a viable candidate. He had just turned 23 years of age. And I think his friends, as much as himself, said, you ought to be running for office. You need to represent us in the Illinois state legislature. This is what he says. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. You don't run for political office unless you have some ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far I shall succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend. At the end of the announcement, there were no recommendations. It was blank. Nobody else wrote into the newspaper and said, I want to recommend Abraham Lincoln to run for political office. I just love this one sentence. I can say for one that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. Wow, I will vote for any political candidate who has his or her understanding of what political office is all about, being worthy of their esteem. Well, Lincoln ran for office in 1832 and he lost. But in the district just surrounding New Salem, he received 799 of the 805 votes. 2 years later, he ran again. There were 14 men running for 4 seats. He finished second of the 14 men and became the youngest member of the Illinois State Legislature. Now we need to back up a little bit and ask ourselves a little bit more about what is the biography of Lincoln. He was born into a family that did not prize really education. Boys would traditionally simply follow what their father had done. His father was often sometimes upset with his young son Abraham because he wanted to spend his time reading, thinking. So Lincoln had no formal education except in January and February, when it was too cold for boys to work outside with their fathers on their farms. Teachers would come through, itinerant teachers, and 8 or 9 families would hire that teacher, and they would teach the boys. And so probably 5 times, maybe 6 times, he studied. That was his only formal education. I just find that incredible. At age 23, he picked up a grammar book for juveniles. I'd like juveniles to read that book today. A lot of the lessons from that book were all taken from the Bible because it was all about a moral education. And half the book was, this is an extra credit question, half the book was declamation. Declamation, what's that all about? Half the book was public speaking. So in the last half of the book, there would be quotations from the Bible, from Shakespeare, from Lord Byron. And so I think early on, someone asked me this question, how do you think Lincoln understood his rise as a politician? I think he understood he could rise as a public speaker. He became a lawyer, but others were lawyers. He fought in the Black Hawk War, but others fought in the Black Hawk War. He developed this incredible speaking ability. I call him our most eloquent president. This is the first public announcement of Abraham Lincoln to the world, 23 years of age. I'm running for political office. Well, he serves in the Illinois State Legislature, and then it moves from Vandalia to Springfield, and he moves from New Salem to Springfield, and he recognizes that he has to increase his ability to become a public speaker, to become a debater. So he joins what's called the Young Men's Lyceum. This was kind of an opportunity to develop your speaking skills. And on a cold winter evening at the Second Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Illinois, he gives his first prominent public speech. It's a long speech. It took a while for Lincoln to learn what a lot of politicians have not yet learned, that often less is more. It's a very long speech. But Lincoln's speaking often sort of tried to connect with what was the problem, what was happening all around him. The problem was what he called mobocracy. The problem was violence. It was everywhere. Elijah Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois, was this marvelous Presbyterian minister. He also edited an anti-slavery newspaper. And 6 months before Lincoln delivered this speech, Elijah Lovejoy was assassinated in the streets of Alton, Illinois, in front of his newspaper. He was killed in the streets. And so Lincoln was very aware of this. So Lincoln asks a remarkable question, and this is why I think it is wisdom for today, because this question just kind of comes down to the present. He's asking the question, where is the problem and how shall we approach it? How then shall we perform it? At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Napoleon Bonaparte was the great military leader of that day, for a commander could not by force, and here's Lincoln's beautiful language, take a drink from the Ohio, or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Less than 30 years old. It's almost just unbelievable. Is he looking forward? He couldn't possibly be to a civil war where we almost destroy ourselves. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Oh my goodness. Well, our third selection is what I call a fragment. Lincoln had a very unusual habit. He wrote little notes to himself. He never thought any of us would ever see these notes. He never titled them. He never dated them. He never signed them. We know they're his because of his distinctive handwriting. There have been documents that have come forward in recent years. About a dozen years ago, a young woman walked into the Abraham Lincoln bookshop in Chicago, a one-of-a-kind store, and she said, you know, I think this is a letter from Abraham Lincoln to my grandfather. Maybe it was her great-grandfather, a congressman in Ohio. And Daniel Weinberg, the proprietor, looked at it and said, this is true. This is a letter from Lincoln. So we have those things coming forward, but I don't think in anybody's attic, if there's one of Lincoln's fragments, never signed, never titled, never dated, probably none will come forward. But we have 111 of them. 111 have survived. I've written a book called Lincoln in Private, and in the back is the appendix which lists all 111. Some are just incredible, including this one. Lincoln ran in the Illinois state legislature, and then he ran for Congress. It was kind of a rotating system. There were three men. He was number 3. He gets into Congress starting in 1847. The United States is in war with Mexico, and he demands of the president, James Polk, to be honest about this war. He believes that Mexico did not start this war, but the United States started this war. Or at least the United States sort of drew the Mexicans into this war. And so he says, you stand where George Washington stand, be honest about this. Tell me the spot where the Mexicans crossed the border into the United States. Well, challenging the President of the United States and perhaps questioning the patriotism of the American Army, when he returned to Springfield after his first 2-year term, many of his constituents said, well, thank you very much. We're not going to elect you again. They didn't quite understand. He said, I'm not questioning the patriotism of the soldiers. I'm questioning the decision of the president to go to war with Mexico. So he became a lawyer. 24 years he served as a lawyer. Only 13, 14 years did he serve as a politician. When I wrote my biography of Abraham Lincoln called A. Lincoln, and the reason it's called A. Lincoln is there were no numbers on houses in Lincoln's lifetime. So he put on the front door of his house a little silver plaque that said A. Lincoln. That's the way you identified whose home this was. He most often signed his name A. Lincoln. Sometimes he would sign it Abraham Lincoln, but very seldom. So now he returns to law, and he believes he will become a full-time lawyer. And he becomes quite a remarkable lawyer. He goes out on what's called the 8th Judicial Circuit, which was the size of the state of Connecticut. He'd be gone 180 or 200 days a year in small towns, riding by horseback, old Bob, or riding by carriage. Craig was asking me at lunch today, well, what did I think about Mary Lincoln? I'm a little more sympathetic to Mary Lincoln. How would you like to be Mary Lincoln when your husband is away 180 to 200 days a year and you're asked to raise all these boys by yourself? I don't think that was very fair of him. The railroads had not yet quite come in, so he was out there. People wanted to study with him. The way that you became a lawyer was there were only 3 law schools during Lincoln's time. So you wanted to study with a lawyer, but Lincoln was never there. He wasn't in Springfield. He was always out traveling the 8th Judicial Circuit. So I think he thought that he would give a lecture to lawyers. Now, if you look at this fragment, and I call it a fragment because it's not complete, notice after July 1st, 1850, there's a question mark. So the editors are sort of trying to decide, when do we think Lincoln wrote this? I think he wrote it after 1850. Because he came back in 1849, I don't think he would give a lecture the year he arrived back. I think he had to have more experience. But I've had the privilege of giving this lecture on Lincoln's lecture to the Baylor University Law School, to talk to law school students. I've spoken to lawyers, I've spoken to judges. Listen to what Lincoln thought a lawyer should be. I am not an accomplished lawyer. That's an amazing way to begin. Can you imagine someone saying, I am not an accomplished politician? I am not an accomplished business person? Lincoln's sense of humility, his understanding of himself is overwhelming. We're just filled with a very boastful kind of culture today. Not Abraham Lincoln. I am not an accomplished lawyer. I find quite as much material for a lecture in those points where I have failed as in those where I have been moderately successful. Think of your own lives. I'm sure if we were really honest with each other, we would discover that we've learned a lot of lessons where we have failed as when we have been moderately successful. He then, believing that speaking is really important, he goes on to say, extemporaneous speaking should be practiced and cultivated. It is the lawyer's avenue to the public. However able and faithful he may be in other respects, people are slow to bring him business if he cannot make a speech. So here, how did he make a speech? We have reports of Lincoln speaking. This tall, gangly man, 6 feet 4 inches tall. If he would be here tonight, he would probably be 6 feet 9 inches tall, maybe 6 feet 10 inches tall, because people were much smaller in the 19th century. His clothes were not usually pressed. His hair was sort of unkempt. He would speak by kind of wandering around and putting his hand there. And I love the story that he goes to a small town and the photographer wants to take his photograph. But the photographer first wants to straighten Lincoln's hair so that the photograph will look pretty good. And when the fella gets behind his camera and looks up, the hair's all messed up again. And Lincoln said, people wouldn't recognize me. People wouldn't recognize me. This was Abraham Lincoln. Discourage litigation. The word was, in Illinois, a frontier state, that people were all going to law. That was the phrase, going to law. They were suing the Illinois Central Railroad, which was burning up their fences alongside of their farms. They were suing each other. And Lincoln's ability as a lawyer, I'm looking at Greg, who was a lawyer, was discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbor to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often the real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. And then I love this particular sentence. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a surprising opportunity of being a good man. There will still be business enough. Lincoln was assassinated 41 days after he delivered the second inaugural address. He was a terrific war president. The whole understanding of being commander-in-chief is a little unclear in our Constitution, but Lincoln checked books out of the Library of Congress. He became the commander-in-chief. He really understood what was going on. If you saw that great movie, Lincoln, I've seen it 7 times, you see him in the telegraph office. He wants to be in communication with his generals. He's pretty good at understanding military strategy, but he thought he'd be a much better peace president. Tired as he was looking forward to a second term. And gamblers in the street at that second inaugural were betting he would be elected to a 3rd term and serve all the way to 1873. What our nation might have become if he had been able to serve a second or a third term. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a surprising opportunity. When we turn the page, we step forward into Lincoln being elected President of the United States. He prepares his first inaugural address. He shows it to several Illinois friends, and they make a selection here, maybe a word here, or a sentence, and then he arrives in Washington, D.C. He goes to church that first Sunday at St. John's Episcopal Church. He has lunch with William Seward, who was his Secretary of State. Seward had been his chief competitor. In fact, in the Republican convention in 1860 in Chicago, Seward led on the first two ballots until Lincoln triumphed on the third ballot. He knows that Seward is a fine public speaker, and so he says, here's a draft, a copy of my first inaugural address. Would you be willing to look at it? And if you have any suggestions, I'd like to hear them. Well, the next evening, there's a knock on the door. It's parlor number 6 at Willard's Hotel. Today we call it the Willard, but it was Mr. Willard, so it was Willard's Hotel. And here is Frederick Seward, William's son. He said, my father, sir, has some suggestions for you. 6 pages of suggestions, 49 suggestions. And at the end, when he gets to the 6th page, he's probably, I can only imagine the look on his face when Seward writes to him, as for your last paragraph, forget it. Lincoln was going to end with a sentence, is it peace or a sword? Here, I've written 2 new last paragraphs for you. You may choose which one to use. So what I've done for us this evening is to take the paragraph that Lincoln chooses to use and show on the left Seward's words, and on the right, Lincoln's words. How Lincoln took Seward's words and changed them into what I think is much more meaningful, much more poetic prose. And I'm going to ask, as we did a little bit on Sunday morning, to say some of this out loud, because I think when you say it out loud, you will catch the meaning. So Seward's first sentence of the paragraph is, I close. Now, ordinarily, if you've been an editor, you know that you want to often edit, you want to shorten phrases. Well, Lincoln doesn't shorten the phrase, he absolutely enlarges the phrase. Let's say Lincoln's first sentence out loud. I am loath to close. As I said on Sunday, Lincoln loved what he called the Saxon Bible. We would think of it as the King James Bible. He had a great sense for the sound of words. When he would write his speeches, he would speak out the words himself, so his secretaries tell us, before he wrote them on the page. So I can imagine that he sort of elongated that word, I am loath to close. Just hear the way that sounds as you're listening to it as an audience. I am loath to close. It increases, I think, the understanding, really the meaning of that opening sentence. Seward then writes in the second sentence, we must not be aliens or enemies, but fellow countrymen. And there's a word missing there, and brethren. Let's say Lincoln's words out loud. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Think of this. Here we are. The war is about to begin. There's a great deal of animosity from the north towards the south and vice versa. And Seward's words, but Lincoln speaks them in a better way. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Then Seward's third sentence, although passion has strained our bonds of affections too hardly, they must not, I am sure they will not, be broken. Now here Lincoln does shorten this, and I think give it much more pungent meaning. Let's say it out loud together. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Just wonderful. Then we've come to the final sentence. I can imagine Lincoln looking at these words of Seward, the mystic chords which proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves, pass through all the hearts and all the hearths in this broad continent of ours, will yet again harmonize in their ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. Pretty wordy. And Lincoln's thinking to himself, how can I make this more eloquent? How can I make it more poetic? How can I make it more meaningful? I just love this final sentence. Let's say it together. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. See, Seward had said the angel of the nation. Well, that's one way to say it. But do you see what Lincoln is doing there? The better angels of our nature. We are involved in this. It's not simply the nation as some external force. It is who we are, the citizens of this nation. I just find the way that Lincoln took somebody else's words and turned them into his own. Well, the war begins. The war, I believe, does begin to save the Union. It does not begin to eliminate slavery. But as the war goes forward, Lincoln comes to the understanding that this war and its purpose must expand, and our understanding of freedom must expand. He goes back again and again to the Declaration of Independence. We may have thought that the Declaration of Independence was always a sacred document, but for many years it was mostly, well, this is the document we use to separate ourselves from Great Britain. Lincoln understands, and we, I think, can understand today, that this is a document about what freedom is all about, and freedom, in a sense, needs to keep expanding as it has. So now he's faced with a question. He signs the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. He frees a large number of enslaved persons. And at the bottom of the Emancipation Proclamation is the possibility that African Americans might serve in the military. But the thought at the time was, well, perhaps they could do the jobs in the back of the line, and that would free more white soldiers to fight. And then Ulysses S. Grant, others say, wait a second, I think these African Americans can fight as soldiers. Well, common thought was they had been so enslaved, so put down, they were so passive, they couldn't possibly have the courage to fight as soldiers. And then they do. And it becomes a remarkable testimony to their courage, and 180,000 African Americans will serve in the Union Army. And so Lincoln is aware of this. Well, there's a rally that's held in Springfield in June of 1863. Specifically in Springfield, these are opponents of the war, and the opponents of the war want the nation returned to what they say is the nation as it was. The nation as it was, a nation with slavery. Even George McClellan, the commander of the Union Army, does not want to make this a nation free for African Americans. So 3 months later, the defendants of the Union say, we need to have another rally, kind of a counter rally in September to say, no, this nation needs to expand and we need to stand for the Union. And so we need to bring Abraham Lincoln to speak. And Abraham Lincoln struggles with the invitation. It would take multiple trains to get there. It would take days to get there. And finally he decides he just can't do it as much as he would like to do it. So he writes out a letter to his friend in Springfield, the lawyer James Conkling, and he said, I ask you to read this. There were about 70,000 people that came to that rally in Springfield from all across the Midwest. Well, how do you speak to 70,000 people? There were 10 speaking stands like this. And 7,000, 5,000 would gather around it, and Conkling would read it. He'd read it, he'd read it, he'd read it, he'd read it. And I think this is one of the great speeches of Abraham Lincoln that deserves much more notice. Listen to it. Peace does not appear so distant as it did. It will come soon and come to stay, and so come to be worth the keeping in all future time. One of the great rhetorical ability of Lincoln was to use repetition. Come, come, come. Listen to that. It will then have been proved that among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. On Sunday morning we talked about Lincoln's use of alliteration. Listen to it in this speech. Ballot, bullet. And that those who take such appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost. Alliteration again. It just tingles on the ear. And then he does something quite daring for this audience. And then there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this great consummation. And he must have thought long and hard whether he wanted to stop there, but he can't stop there. While I fear there will be some white ones, unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. I'll tell you, the African American community just rejoiced when they heard this, because the question then and even now is, was Abraham Lincoln really anti-slavery? Or did he just do this as a politician? Or did he just do this as a military maneuver? No, I think he felt this deeply. As a young boy of age 19, he took some produce down to New Orleans. And when he got to New Orleans, he saw two wharves on either side of the Mississippi River. On one side were men, on the other side were women with their children. He was just aghast. Marriage, of course, was not recognized among enslaved people. And it's very possible that the men would be sent one place, the women would be sent another place, and they'd be divided. And so I think Lincoln cared very, very deeply about slavery. And I think this was part of who he was. Not on this particular handout, but I'm really struck by the story that when the Emancipation Proclamation began to offer the opportunity for African Americans to serve in the Union Army, why the governor of Kentucky was really upset by this, because the African Americans were all leaving the agricultural fields of Kentucky. So he wrote 3 letters to Lincoln. Wasn't satisfied. So finally he said, I'm going to go to Washington and talk to him face to face. So he went with a United States senator, editor of the leading newspaper in Kentucky, and Lincoln met them on a Saturday morning at the White House. And these are the words that he said to them. I am naturally anti-slavery. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. These are not men from Massachusetts. These were men from Kentucky. He was telling them how he really felt about this. But, of course, all through the war, he had to be very astute politically, because if he would lose the border states, he would lose the whole thing. So he had to kind of balance this. He was a very astute politician. We come to the final selection before we have an opportunity for questions and comments. On Sunday morning, we gave Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, his remarkable second inaugural address. What the audience did not know, that there was another fragment that stood behind that address. No one knew about it. It's called here the Meditation on the Divine Will. That's not Lincoln's title. He wrote this on September 2nd, we believe, of 1862. The North had lost once again a battle, the Second Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. He convened an emergency cabinet meeting. Fortunately for us, 3 of his secretaries, 3 of his cabinet members, kept diaries. And one of them said, Lincoln told us that he was filled with such anguish, he almost felt like hanging himself. He almost felt like hanging himself as the North had lost one more time. And then he sat down, we believe, that afternoon, and he wrote this. John Hay, his young secretary, found it after Lincoln's death, and he gave it the title, Meditation on the Divine Will. You can see Hay's handwriting. It's a good title, but let's listen to it. And those of you who have heard these, read the second inaugural, you'll see how this is the foundation of the second inaugural. The will of God prevails. I said on Sunday morning, let me just repeat this, that Lincoln was born into a Christian family a Baptist family, part of the Second Great Awakening in Kentucky and southern Indiana. But like many young people, he rejected his family's faith. He became a deist. If there's a God, it's kind of a watchmaker God. When he lived in New Salem, he actually wrote a paper criticizing the Bible, and one of his friends snatched it out of his hands and threw it in the fire. That's not a smart thing to do for an aspiring young politician. We're all on a journey. Some of us have wondered and worried about our own children, our own grandchildren in terms of our faith, but they don't necessarily seem to be following that faith. But Lincoln's on a journey, and our children and grandchildren are on their journey. And so when life begins to tumble in, when Willie dies, first Eddie dies at 3.5 in 1850, and the Presbyterian minister comes to conduct the funeral. Then Willie dies in 1862 in the White House, who's only 11, and Phineas Densmore Gurley, who I call the missing person in the Lincoln story, the minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, comes to offer the funeral meditation, and he says to Abraham Lincoln, Mary Lincoln was so overcome with grief she couldn't even be at the service. He says to Abraham, I ask you to trust in biblical providence. Biblical providence. So in this meditation and in the second inaugural, this is no longer deism. This is providence. Those of us who are Christian believe in God's providence. God is a loving God who loves human beings and who acts in history. So Lincoln writes, the will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. And he actually underlines these words, these are his underlines, both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Lincoln's a very logical thinker. In the present Civil War, it's quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end. By his mere quiet power, Lincoln was tired of the noisy God he had met as a young person. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Are you suggesting he could give the victory to the Confederate side? Well, he's not going to say this out loud, but that's what he's thinking. Yet the contest proceeds. I kind of wondered about this one sentence. How do you think he said it? I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, or perhaps it's more, I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest. This is a marker on Lincoln's faith journey. It's quite philosophical, quite theological. 2.5 years later, it will now become much more experiential. Every drop of blood drawn by the lash. He now makes that second inaugural statement. I just have wondered, what might he have said if he had lived into a second and a third term? I think his Christian faith was just coming alive, and he was willing to talk about it in a public way, in just such a profound way. So I think there is so much here for us to think about. We've done this as a handout that you can take it with you and think about it some more. We could have had another dozen selections from Abraham Lincoln that show his own march forward as a politician, as a thinker, as a speaker, as a person deeply imbued by the Bible. I think Abraham Lincoln's wisdom for today speaks to us today, and that the values that he represents are ones that we need to think about, embody, and carry forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. We have time for questions, and anybody would like to ask a question?
And I'll repeat the questions.
Okay, we'll take the mic.
I served in Washington in the 1960s at Walter Reed, and was privileged to go to a rather modest church in Georgetown, which was said to be a church Lincoln had attended. I will remark that there were only 12 people in the congregation that day, so I was quite disappointed. Is that the church he likely would have attended, or would it have been another one?
Good question. Is that the church, the Georgetown church? The church that he attended and is there today is the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. There is a Lincoln pew there. As I said, Phineas Densmore Gurley was the minister. I think he's the missing person in the story. Sometimes ministers are missing persons in the story in terms of how important they are in our lives. He was number one in his class at Princeton Seminary, and his sermons many of his sermons are at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. And if you read the sermons, they're not dated. Why did he date the sermons? But they're filled with this whole providential understanding. God is the God who is providential, who leads, who wills, who loves. And so Lincoln's listening to these sermons. One time, the story goes, I think it's true, that he had a prayer meeting on, I think, Thursday nights, and Lincoln was worried if when he went to events, he was often besieged by office seekers. And so Phineas Densmore Gurley said, well, here's what you do. You sit in my office and have the door kind of cracked open, and you'll be able to listen, because Gurley would start with a meditation. You can hear what I say, but you won't have to be part of the congregation. And so this is the church that he attended. Yeah.
Well, who else has a question? Yes, I'll bring the mic to you.
Maybe wait for the microphone. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm wondering, in your comparison of Seward and Abraham Lincoln's address, why would Seward, if he was an opponent running against Lincoln, why would he help him out with the address?
Why was the opponent help him out? You're talking about Seward?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this is a very interesting story. Secretaries of State were really important. Many secretaries of State, John Quincy Adams, would become president. So by April 1st, after Lincoln had been inaugurated on March 4, 1861, there was criticism that we weren't sure what the policy is of Abraham Lincoln. So Seward writes Lincoln a letter, and he says something to the effect that it doesn't seem that we have a real policy going forward. If it's all right with you, I think I will give the nation, give the newspapers the policy. And whether Lincoln really returned to that letter, he actually came to Seward the next day and said, if it's all right with you, I'm the President of the United States, and I think I will direct the policy. 1 month later, Seward wrote to his wife, staying in their home in Auburn, New York, and he simply said this sentence: Lincoln is the best of all of us. Lincoln is the best of all of us. What a remarkable friendship. Lincoln would walk across Lafayette Square at night to Seward's home to meet with this man. Seward was known for his profanity. Boy, he could really wing it out there. Lincoln most often did not use profanity. Seward had this huge, marvelous liquor cabinet. Lincoln was a teetotaler. Seward loved to smoke cigars. Lincoln didn't smoke at all. But these two men formed this, it's sort of there in the movie, these two men formed this incredible friendship. You might think they were opposites in terms of personality, but Lincoln came to really revere Seward and Seward Lincoln. And you may know, or maybe forgotten, that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, one of his accomplices attempted to assassinate Seward and wounded him deeply, hoping he could kill Seward too, because he knew that the next important person in that administration was William Seward. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you for your comments. I was curious about another friendship that Abraham Lincoln had, and this one is with Ulysses S. Grant. Could you talk about how that developed and then how he recognized that Ulysses S. Grant was the general he needed?
Thank you. The question and the comment is that he understood that Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant were great friends. Well, Lincoln really was a hands-on commander-in-chief. So before Grant, he would either invite the commanding general to the White House or he would go out to visit them. Well, George McClellan became one of the first commanders. He called himself, or people called him, the Little Napoleon. McClellan wrote a letter to his wife saying, everybody recognizes now that I'm going to be the savior of this nation. They recognize my terrific ability. So the story is told that Lincoln and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, went down to visit McClellan one night in those kind of old-fashioned homes. There were a couple of parlors, and Mrs. McClellan said, well, the general isn't in yet. I'll let him know when you arrive. So McClellan arrives, bypasses Lincoln, goes upstairs, and goes to bed. And Stanton says to Lincoln, how could you abide this kind of behavior? And Lincoln says to Stanton, listen, I will hold McClellan's horse if he is willing to lead us to victory. So when he met Ulysses S. Grant, he met someone who was from the West being Ohio and Illinois, who didn't complain like McClellan did, who didn't boast like McClellan did, who just did his job and was very understated, was really quite humble. And so he finally calls Ulysses S. Grant to Washington to lead all the Union armies. Ulysses S. Grant arrives. He arrives at Willard's Hotel with his son. They walk in. He's wearing his, what they call a duster, kind of an overcoat or raincoat. They come up to the front desk and he says, sir, if I may, I'd like to get a room for the next couple of evenings. And the desk clerk says, you want a room? Do you not realize this is the Civil War going on? And you're in Washington, D.C.? Who do you think you are? Well, I can give you a room on the top floor, a tiny room. And Ulysses S. Grant said, that will be fine. So he said, please sign the register. So he signs the register. Ulysses S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois. The desk clerk turns that register around and is, why didn't you tell me who you were? Well, that's the last thing Ulysses S. Grant would have said. We got a lot of people who say, don't you know who I am? Not Ulysses S. Grant. I just think that story epitomizes who he is, and Lincoln loved him for it. Lincoln loved him for it. A lot of these stories about Lincoln are apocryphal, so this may or may not be true, but the word was that Grant did some drinking. So the apocryphal story, or maybe the true story, is Lincoln said, let's find out what Grant is drinking, and let's give it to the other generals too. So when the war is over, and Grant comes to Washington, and Lincoln invites Ulysses and Julia to accompany them to Ford's Theater. And Julia believes she's being stalked by someone that day, a man in a buckboard. Here's a man, there's a man. And their children they haven't seen in a long time. They're living in a town just outside of Philadelphia. So she persuades Ulysses not to attend Ford's Theater that evening. So they take the train. When they get to Philadelphia, the messenger rushes up to him to tell him of the assassination. And Grant thinks, if I had only been there, I don't think it would have made any difference if he had been there. So Grant never compared himself to Lincoln. But after the disastrous presidency of Andrew Johnson, he stepped forward in one sense to kind of carry on the legacy of Lincoln. So I think of them as kind of a mutual admiration society, these two Western men, very humble in their own way. They really admired each other.
Yeah, Alex.
Thank you. Is there anything that leads you to write about Union figures versus Confederate figures in the war and the history?
Good question. Is there anything that prompted me to write about Union figures versus Confederate figures? I've never thought about that. I mean, people suggested, should I write a biography? People suggest this all the time. Would I write a biography of Robert E. Lee? I guess I'm not, you know, I've been reading a biography now of Jimmy Carter after the remarkable memorial service and everything, and I thought, I could never have written a biography of Jimmy Carter because I've never lived in the South. I wouldn't really understand that at all. But I'm not against writing about a Confederate figure. There's some remarkable Confederate figures. One of the very unknown stories, as we now want to tar and feather every Confederate general as a traitor, which I think is just ridiculous. When Stonewall Jackson died, really shot by his own men inadvertently, Abraham Lincoln wrote an op-ed in the local Washington paper praising Stonewall Jackson. Praising Stonewall Jackson as a Christian general of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln did that. We're, though, much more morally superior, so we're unwilling to give Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee or anybody else any credit today. Good question. I just have not had the opportunity to do so.
Anybody else? Here we go.
I hesitated even raising my hand because of my ignorance about Abraham Lincoln and Civil War history. But I read a little bit about it because I wonder about this. I know Lincoln was a great man, a smart man, and why didn't he think that he could maybe follow one of the compromises that were brought up in the Congress, and they talked about maybe not going to war? Can we work with the South, and can we try to avoid what happened? I think 1.5 million people were injured or killed, and please explain that, because I know there's an explanation.
Sometimes the sound is a little difficult for me to hear. I think I hear your question is, why did we go to war, or why did we not go to war?
Yeah, could Lincoln have averted that by compromising in some ways?
Yeah. Well, in his first inaugural, he says, you know, the burden of what we're going to do is not in my hands, but in yours. You can decide if you want to do this. And so he thought, mistakenly, that there was a large Union sentiment in the South. He sent an emissary to the South who discovered there is almost no Union sentiment in the South. So we could argue and discuss over how Fort Sumter began. He took a vote in his cabinet about should we resupply Fort Sumter. And the vote was 6-2 not to resupply Fort Sumter. So he said, thank you very much, we're going to resupply Fort Sumter. And you can think about or argue about how did that produce that war. But for decades before, the war, in a sense, was coming. And we could have a longer conversation. I think Lincoln finally felt we've come to the point where we have to decide this issue. And the issue really is about the Union, because the real argument that was taking place was a wonderful person like, say, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. He really believed that there were two forms of government, the states and the federal government. And therefore, if the states wanted to nullify something, like nullify the tariff of 1832, they could do so. And the federal government could overcome it by a 3/4 vote. Lincoln believed, I believe correctly, that the Declaration of Independence was never voted on by states. There wasn't any states voting on it. There were individuals who voted on it, we the people, and that the United States was a compact union before it ever became an official country, and that if we allowed states' rights to be the way that we understood our nation, we would be torn apart again and again and again. Much more to say. Thank you for the question.
So, Ron, we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I think it'd be interesting for folks to hear your story. You didn't write the second inaugural book till about 20 years ago. You were in academia, and now you are a well-renowned scholar in history. How did that happen? You didn't start out to be a biographer, right?
No, I did not. Well, in 1993, the Huntington Library in San Marino, which is one of the great libraries in our nation, put on the largest, at that time, Lincoln exhibit. They brought things from Springfield. The largest individual donor, a person, Louise Tabor, brought her things. I was teaching in the history department at UCLA, and I thought, well, I'm looking for a way to engage students, so I'll offer a seminar on Lincoln. I don't really know any much. and I'll take them to the exhibit. And we started reading Lincoln in an anthology, and we were all caught up in this, and we really enjoyed it. And I was especially struck by the second inaugural because of my own Christian faith, and I never quite realized that this document, 14 times he mentions God, 4 times he quotes the Bible, 3 times he invokes prayer in but 701 words. So I got involved in this. I taught this class. I submitted a chapter for a book on religion in the American Civil War. And then one day at the Huntington Library, someone said to me, "You can write for a larger audience." I have to be careful when I say this. Most academics cannot. He said, "Could I introduce you to my literary agent in New York?" I didn't know this world existed. So I met this woman, Mary Evans, my literary agent, and she said, "Let's go forward." And after I submitted a proposal based on her reputation, not mine, I'd written some books, but nobody had ever heard of me. In 2 days, we had our first offer. In 2 days, the book became Lincoln's greatest speech. So this is, and I had a lot to learn. Behind all writers are great editors. Malcolm Gladwell says it takes 10,000 hours to be good at anything. So I had a lot to learn about being a writer. So that kind of transformed my life. I was getting on there in years. I was a Johnny-come-lately. I hadn't been doing Lincoln all my lifetime. And so it's been a wonderful opportunity. It's been a wonderful opportunity to speak to lots of different groups, but I really enjoyed what we're doing here this evening, to speak to congregations, to Christian people, to say our American story is really often a faith story, and we need to understand it more deeply.
So you've written about Chamberlain. Is there a next book in the works?
There is. Often the next book is someone else suggests it. I'm calling it Unprecedented, the third act of John Quincy Adams. I'm going back in time. John Quincy Adams is the only person before Lincoln who ever quoted the Bible in an inaugural address. "Unless the Lord builds the city, those who build it labor in vain." He was an ineffective president, but at age 64, he was elected to Congress, and he would serve until he was 80. No other president has ever served in elective office. I praise Jimmy Carter for his post-presidency, but no one has served in elective office. He was very reluctant to talk about slavery as a president. Suddenly he begins to talk about the slavocracy. He defends the slaves on the ship Amistad. And this man just becomes to me a larger-than-life person. I call it the third act. I think some of us here this evening are in our third act. I think I'm in my third act. The idea that those of us who are in our 60s, 70s, and 80s, oh, we're over the hill, we don't have anything left to contribute, that's not true. And so John Quincy Adams to me is a poster child for the third act. We can still do things, we can think new thoughts, we can drive through new pathways. So I'm having a lot of fun. John Quincy Adams got up every day at 4 a.m. and read the Bible for 1 hour. For 1 hour. He read the entire Bible through every year of his adult life. This is a story not known because the traditional historian doesn't really want to tell the faith story of these remarkable figures. So that's the next book.
Okay. I think we need to wrap it up. Would you join me in thanking... Ron, your knowledge, your own story, your faith, your passion is contagious. We thank you for being with us these few days. I'm going to offer a closing blessing, and then Ron is going to come over to the book table, and you're welcome to purchase a book. We'll work a line out by seating in the pews, but would you pray with me? Gracious God, on this February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, we've looked back. We thank you for your servant Ron and his passion and scholarship and accessibility, making Lincoln so real to us, and especially the values that he held. Help us and search our hearts that you might sustain us by your courage. Give us your spirit. And as we go from this place tonight, we ask for traveling mercies and a good rest, and a good day tomorrow when the sun will rise again. And this we pray with thanksgiving in Jesus' name. Amen. So Ron, come this way and we'll get you set up.